Imagine it is December 16, 1835. The temperature in New York is plummeted to 17 degrees below zero, the coldest night in 36 years. At 9 p.m., a night watchman making his rounds smells something out of place. It's coming from the Comstock and Andrews dry goods store on Merchant Street. He raises the alarm, but within 20 minutes, the building isn't just on fire, it is an ocean of flame. When the fire department arrives, they find a nightmare that defies the laws of physics. The East River and the Hudson are frozen solid. The water freezes solid inside the leather lines before it can ever hit the flames. The firefighters, exhausted from two large blazes just 2 nights prior, are forced to stand back. They watch as the Merchants Exchange, the post office, and 700 buildings melt into the horizon, while iron shutters built to protect property turned into blast furnaces that incinerated everything inside. Pause. This was the Great Fire of 1835. It was the moment the haphazard history of New York reached its breaking point. To survive, it had to become something else. Pause. It had to become a machine. It proved that New York could no longer be a collection of wooden shanties and colonial relics. We are moving through the 19th century, a 100-year span where the city transitioned from a chaotic landscape of swamps and rocky outcroppings to a Republican predilection for control. This is the story of how New York was literally scratched into the earth by a surveyor obsessed with a broken screw, and how it was unified by an iron thread that demanded a blood sacrifice from the family that designed it. We will walk with John Randall, JRB, as he battles cabbage-throwing landowners to impose the grid. Pause. We will descend into the Dante's Inferno of the Brooklyn Bridge caissons, where men work naked to the waist in 80-degree heat while standing in icy water. And we will witness the political heist of the century, the 1898 consolidation that was decided by a margin so thin you could fit it in a single crowded tenement hallway. This is the era of the iron thread. Let's begin. Before the fire of 1835, New York was growing with no master plan. In 1807, the New York State Legislature decided that the orderly development of the city was a matter of state survival. They appointed a commission to map a grid of 155 streets and 12 avenues. To do the work, they hired a 20-year-old surveyor named John Randall, JRB. Randall was a precision fanatic. His tools, transit chains, compasses, and high-precision instruments of his own design, were his religion. While surveying in the wild northern reaches of the Island, Randall accidentally broke a small screw on one of his instruments. Most men would have made do. Not Randall. He packed up his gear and walked 3 miles south back into the settled city, just to have that single screw repaired to his exacting standards. But the grid wasn't just a map. It was a weapon of eminent domain. Randall's task was to ignore the hills, the streams, and the history of the land. He was to treat the island as a flat, geometric plane. Landowners were horrified. They saw Randall and his men as invaders. In one famous instance, Randall was confronted by a venerable old woman who had sold vegetables downtown for 20 years. Until the surveyors retreated, Randall was arrested for trespassing multiple times. But Randall was robotic in his persistence. He placed marble monumental stones at the future intersections of a city that didn't exist yet. The grid was uninteresting to many critics of the day, but became the supercomputer of New York's growth, turning the chaos of Manhattan into a Cartesian machine for commerce. The grid gave New York its bones, but the Great Fire of 1835 proved it had no blood. The $20 million in damage caused by the fire was the final proof that the city's subpar water supply was a death trap. The city's wells were polluted, leading to horrific outbreaks of cholera and yellow fever. In the 1832 epidemic, nearly half the city's population fled to the countryside to escape the poisoned water. New York realized it couldn't march north if its people were dying of thirst. In 1837, John B. Jervis began the construction of the Croton Aqueduct. This wasn't just a pipe, it was a 41-mile-long, gravity-fed miracle of engineering. It meant a steady drop of only 13 inches per mile over the entire distance, ensuring that water would flow from Westchester to Manhattan. Thousands of Irish immigrants worked in harsh conditions to dig the tunnels, without the need for a single mechanical pump, and build the stone embankments. Jervis was a strict leader, famously discouraging any liquor consumption. By 1842, the water reached the High Bridge, an arched masonry structure that carried the aqueduct across the Harlem River. When the water finally gushed from a fountain in City Hall Park on October 14, 1842, the city erupted in a gun salute. New York now had 45 million gallons of mountain water arriving daily. The machine had its fuel. As the city moved north, it also looked east. Across the river lay Brooklyn, the third largest city in America, and a sovereign rival to Manhattan. The only way to cross the East River was by ferry, a trip that was often deadly in the winter when the ice-clogged river ground commerce to a halt. John A. Roebling, a visionary who had introduced wire rope to America, proposed a suspension span longer than anything ever built, but the bridge demanded a sacrifice before the first stone was even laid. While surveying the site in 1869, Roebling's foot was crushed by a ferry. He refused traditional medical treatment, opting for a water cure, and died of tetanus weeks later. His son, Washington Roebling, took over as chief engineer. He moved the project forward, but he soon faced a monster in the riverbed, the caissons. Workers had to dig down to bedrock under the river. They used caissons, massive, airtight wooden boxes sunk to the bottom. Inside, it created an environment that workers described as Dante's Inferno. The heat was suffocating, often over 80 degrees. The pressure was so intense that workers' eardrums would often burst if the air was brought in too quickly. But the real danger was the Benz caisson disease. Rising from the depths too fast caused nitrogen to bubble in the blood. Washington Roebling spent more time in the caissons than anyone, and in 1872, he suffered a debilitating attack that left him paralyzed, partially blind, and deaf. He was forced to retreat to his house in Brooklyn Heights, watching the construction through a telescope from his window. For the next 11 years, the bridge was built by Emily Warren Roebling. She was more than a messenger. She took a crash course in higher mathematics and engineering, mastering stress analysis and the complex calculations of catenary curves. She was the field marshal on the construction site, managing assistant engineers and negotiating with skeptical politicians. She even managed a massive crisis in 1878, the wire fraud. A contractor named J. Lloyd Hay was found to be shipping rejected, substandard wire to the site and secretly swapping it for good wire at a hidden warehouse. By the time it was discovered, the bad wire was already woven into the cables. Rather than tear it down, Washington and Emily calculated that the bridge's design was so over-engineered that they could simply add 150 extra wires to each cable to compensate for the fraud. When the bridge opened in 1883, Emily was the first to cross carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. The bridge was the iron thread that made the union of the two cities inevitable. The physical bridge led to a political war. Proponents of a Greater New York, led by Andrew Haswell Green, argued that the separate cities were inefficient and mismanaged. Green, known as the father of Greater New York, saw the consolidation as the only way to prevent Chicago from surpassing New York as the most populous American city. But Brooklyn didn't want to be swallowed. They feared Manhattan's corrupt Tammany Hall would loot their resources and destroy their identity as the city of homes and churches. They protested with the theme song, "Up with the Flag," of Brooklyn. The fate of the modern world was decided on a single Tuesday in November 1894. The referendum in Manhattan was a landslide in favor of consolidation, but in Brooklyn, the tension was unbearable. The margin was just 277 votes. On January 1, 1898, as the bells of Trinity Church rang at midnight, the 5 boroughs became one city of New York. Overnight, the city became the second largest in the world, unified by law, infrastructure, and iron. You can still touch this history today. If you go to the southern end of Central Park, near what would have been the intersection of 65th Street and 6th Avenue, look closely at the gray Manhattan schist outcroppings. There, you might find a small, unassuming iron bolt hammered into the rock over 200 years ago by John Randall, Jr.B. It is a phantom limb of the original grid plan, a marker that stayed behind even as the city grew around it. Walk across the Brooklyn Bridge and stand in the Emily Warren Roebling Plaza on the Brooklyn side. Look up at the massive granite anchors and the 16-inch thick steel cables. They are still holding 140 years later. When you turn on a tap in a Manhattan apartment or a Brooklyn brownstone, you are drinking from the same gravity-fed system that John B. Jervis designed. to save a city that was burning to the ground. In 1835, New York was now one city, a unified metropolis of law and iron. But as the streets became more crowded and the vertical kingdom grew taller, the city began to hide its secrets in the one place no one wanted to go, the dark. In our next episode, we go underground. We will explore a cathedral in the ghost a subway station so beautiful was kept a secret.